James Winslow had always dreamed of living closer to nature, away from the noise and chaos of the city. After years of working as a high school biology teacher in a crowded urban environment, he finally decided to make a change. When his grandfather passed away, leaving him a small piece of land deep in the countryside, it felt like fate was giving him the perfect opportunity. The land was a hidden gem, surrounded by dense woods and far from any major developments. There were no neighbors for miles, no loud traffic, just the serene sound of wind rustling through the trees and birds chirping in the early morning. For James, it was everything he had ever wanted: peace, solitude, and the chance to live a life more in tune with nature. Despite his excitement, James knew that moving out there wouldn't be easy. The land hadn't been used for decades and was overgrown with wild plants, the soil uneven and rough. But he wasn't one to back down from a challenge. He spent months planning every detail, from clearing a small portion of the land to designing a modest but well-built tiny house. He wanted something simple, efficient, and eco-friendly. Using his savings, he hired a local builder who specialized in sustainable materials, ensuring the house blended into the natural surroundings rather than dominating them. When the house was finally complete, it was exactly as he had envisioned: a cozy little home with large windows that let in plenty of sunlight and offered a stunning view of the forest beyond. James loved every moment of his new life. He woke up early every morning, brewed himself a cup of strong black coffee, and sat on his front porch, watching the mist rise from the forest floor. He spent his days teaching online courses to students from all over the world, something he had started during the pandemic and decided to continue even after things returned to normal. His work gave him the flexibility to live anywhere, and now he felt truly free. On weekends, he explored the woods, mapping out trails and identifying different species of plants and wildlife. It was a biologist's dream, and he couldn't have been happier. For the first few months, everything went smoothly. James kept to himself, rarely needing to leave the property except for occasional trips to town for supplies. The nearest settlement was a small rural community about 20 miles away, a quiet place where everyone knew each other. James didn't socialize much. He was an introvert by nature, but when he did visit the local general store or post office, the townspeople were friendly enough. They seemed curious about the new guy living out in the woods, but no one pried too much into his business, which suited him just fine. One evening, as James was finishing up his work for the day, he noticed something odd in his mailbox. He didn't usually get much mail. Most of his correspondence was done electronically, but today, there was an official-looking envelope with no return address. Curious, he opened it and began to read. His brow furrowed as he scanned the contents of the letter. It was from a local property association, claiming that his tiny house was in violation of several regulations regarding building style and land use. The letter demanded that he either make changes to his property to comply with their rules or face a series of escalating fines. Failure to comply, the letter warned, could result in legal action, including the potential seizure of his land. James was baffled. He hadn't joined any property association, nor had he ever heard of one operating in the area. As far as he knew, his grandfather's land had always been outside the boundaries of any formal community. Confused and a little concerned, he reread the letter, trying to make sense of what was going on. The language was dense and legalistic, filled with references to regulations and bylaws that he had never seen before. It felt aggressive, almost threatening, as if whoever had sent it wanted to intimidate him into compliance. He decided to do some research. That night, he combed through every document he had inherited, with the property, the deed, old maps, and a few handwritten notes his grandfather had left behind. Nothing indicated that the land was subject to any external rules or oversight. If anything, the records confirmed that the property was privately owned and had been in the family for generations. Frustrated but determined, James resolved to find out more. He made a mental note to contact a lawyer the next morning and, if necessary, visit the county office to get clarification on the matter. Despite his logical approach, James couldn't shake a lingering sense of unease. He found himself glancing out the window more often than usual, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. It was silly, he told himself. The letter was probably just a mistake, some bureaucratic mix-up that could be easily resolved. Still, the whole thing left a bad taste in his mouth. He had worked so hard to build his home, and now it felt as though someone was trying to take it away from him. The next day, he drove into town and stopped by the local library to use their public records archive. After a couple of hours of searching, he found something strange. About a year ago, a new development company had acquired several large parcels of land near his property. The company had ambitious plans to build a luxury gated community, complete with high-end houses and recreational facilities. The project was still in the early stages, but it was clear they intended to expand aggressively. James couldn't help but wonder if this was somehow connected to the letter he had received. Were they trying to force him out so they could buy up his land and incorporate it into their development? As he sat in the quiet library, surrounded by old maps and dusty files, James felt a spark of defiance ignite within him. He wasn't going to let some corporation bully him into leaving the place he had worked so hard to call home. If they wanted a fight, he was ready to give them one. But he also knew he had to be smart about it. This wasn't just a personal matter, it was about standing up for his rights and protecting something that truly mattered to him. Returning home that evening, James couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of a larger battle. He had no idea what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going down without a fight. The next morning, James Winslow woke up with a clear purpose. He needed answers. The letter he had received was too detailed, too precise to be a simple mistake. Someone had gone through the effort of drafting it, outlining specific rules and threatening legal action. It wasn't something random or casual, there was an intent behind it, and that intent, James suspected, was to make him leave. But why? His grandfather's property had always been isolated, far from any organized community. There weren't even proper roads leading to it, just an old gravel path surrounded by thick forest. So how could anyone suddenly claim jurisdiction over his land? James brewed his usual morning coffee and sat on the front porch, looking out at the woods as he sipped from his favorite mug. The air was crisp, and the early sunlight filtered through the trees in long golden beams. Normally this was his favorite part of the day, a moment of peace before diving into work. But today he couldn't relax. His mind was racing, going over every possible scenario. What if they really could take his land? What if this was the beginning of a legal nightmare he wasn't prepared for? He knew he couldn't face it alone. He needed professional help. After finishing his coffee, he grabbed his phone and called Lisa Raines, a real estate attorney he had met during the purchase process. She was sharp, experienced, and had a reputation for being thorough. James explained the situation in detail, reading the letter aloud so she could understand exactly what he was up against. Lisa listened carefully, asking a few clarifying questions before giving her initial thoughts. "This is strange," she said. "If your property was never part of a regulated community before, they can't just retroactively impose rules on it. I've seen cases where new developments try to absorb surrounding areas by expanding their jurisdiction. But there's a legal process involved. They can't just send you a letter and expect compliance." "So what do you suggest I do?" James asked, feeling slightly more hopeful now that someone with expertise was on his side. "First, we'll file a formal request for documentation. They need to prove that your property is within their jurisdiction and that they have the authority to enforce these regulations. Without that, their letter has no legal standing. I'll draft the request and send it today. In the meantime, don't respond directly to them. Let's see what they come back with." James thanked Lisa and hung up, feeling a bit more grounded. At least now he had a plan. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. This wasn't just about enforcing rules, it felt like someone was targeting him specifically. But why? Was it because he was new to the area? Or was there something about his land that made it valuable to others? Later that afternoon, James drove into town to run some errands. He needed supplies for a few home repairs he had been putting off, and the trip gave him an excuse to clear his head. The small town was quiet, as usual. A few people milled about near the general store, chatting in the lazy way typical of rural communities. James nodded politely to a couple of familiar faces but didn't stop to talk. He wasn't in the mood for small talk. At the hardware store, he picked up some lumber, nails, and a few other items before heading to the checkout counter. As he paid, the cashier, an older man named Greg, gave him a curious look. "Heard you got one of those letters," Greg said, his voice low, as if he didn't want others to overhear. James blinked in surprise. "How did you know about that?" Greg shrugged. "Word gets around fast in a place like this. You're not the first. They've been sending those letters to a few folks living outside town, trying to scare people into selling. Most ignore it, but a couple of folks packed up and left." James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. So it wasn't just him. Whoever was behind this was targeting multiple properties, likely with the same goal to push the owners out. He thanked Greg for the information and left the store, his mind now racing even more. This confirmed his suspicion that the letter wasn't about enforcing legitimate rules, it was a tactic, part of a larger plan to acquire land. As he loaded his supplies into the truck, James thought about what Greg had said. A couple of people had already given in and left. What had made them leave? Were they harassed? Threatened? He didn't know, but one thing was clear: whoever was behind this wasn't going to stop at a single letter. They would escalate, and he needed to be ready. The following day, Lisa called back with an update. "I sent the formal request this morning," she said. "Legally, they have to respond within a certain time frame. If they don't, we can use that against them if this goes to court. But don't be surprised if they try to stall or come back with something vague. That's typical in cases like these." "What do we do if they don't respond at all?" James asked. "Then we file a preemptive motion, basically forcing their hand. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Give them a few days. In the meantime, keep an eye out for anything unusual. If you notice any activity around your property, people snooping around, vehicles stopping near your driveway, document it. Take pictures, write down dates and times. It might not seem like much now, but it could be useful later." James agreed, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. He didn't want to live in a constant state of vigilance, but he also wasn't naive. If this was a coordinated effort to push him out, they might try more direct methods. He had to be prepared. That evening, as he was working on one of the home repairs, James noticed headlights in the distance. They weren't moving, just sitting there, partially hidden by the trees lining his driveway. He set down his tools and walked over to get a better look. As soon as he approached, the vehicle turned around and sped off, disappearing into the darkness. It was unsettling. Whoever it was had no reason to be there, especially at that hour. James made a note of the time and decided to install a few more motion-activated lights around the property. He didn't want to be caught off guard again. The next few days were quiet, but the tension lingered. Every time he stepped outside, James found himself glancing toward the road, half expecting to see another car lurking in the shadows. He hated feeling this way, on edge, constantly alert, but he knew it was necessary. If they were trying to intimidate him, he wouldn't give them the satisfaction of showing fear. Finally, on the 5th day, Lisa called with news. "I got a response," she said, her tone careful. "It's vague, as I expected. They didn't provide any concrete proof of jurisdiction, just a reference to a supposed boundary expansion from years ago. I'm going to need to dig deeper into this." "What's our next move?" James asked. "For now, we wait. I'm filing another request, this time for public records related to that boundary expansion. If we can prove they didn't follow the proper process, we can invalidate their claim entirely. But this might take a while." James sighed. He appreciated Lisa's thoroughness, but the waiting game was wearing on him. Still, he knew she was right. Rushing into a confrontation without solid evidence wouldn't help his case. As the call ended, James looked out at his property, the familiar sight of the forest bringing him a brief sense of calm. He had come here to find peace, to build a life away from the noise and stress of the city. Now it seemed he had found himself in the middle of a battle he never asked for. But one thing was certain: he wasn't going to back down. This was his home, and he was prepared to fight for it, no matter what it took. Over the next few days, James tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. Even simple tasks, like tending to the garden or working on his online biology lessons, felt heavier than before. The thought of someone watching his every move gnawed at him, and he found himself frequently glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see another vehicle lurking in the shadows. He told himself that it might have been a coincidence, that perhaps it was just a passerby lost on the winding country road, but deep down he knew better. The vehicle hadn't been there by accident. Lisa kept him updated regularly, though the news wasn't always encouraging. The second request she had filed for public records had met resistance. The local authorities claimed that the documents were unavailable due to administrative delays. It was the sort of bureaucratic excuse James had expected, but it didn't make things any easier. Whoever was behind this wasn't just acting alone, they seemed to have influence, perhaps even within local government agencies. Meanwhile, James noticed something strange happening around his property. One morning, as he walked out to the edge of his driveway, he saw that someone had placed small wooden stakes in the ground, each one with a bright orange flag attached to it. They formed a rough boundary line around his property, and he counted at least a dozen of them. There was no note, no explanation, just the silent implication that someone had been there during the night. James immediately called Lisa to report what he had found. "It looks like they're trying to mark out my property lines, but I don't know why," he said, his frustration evident in his voice. "Marking boundaries without the owner's permission is a bold move," Lisa replied. "Legally, they can't do that unless they filed for a formal survey, and even then, they'd need to notify you in advance. This could be an intimidation tactic or worse, a sign that they're planning something more serious." "What should I do?" James asked. "For now, document everything. Take photos of the stakes, note their exact positions, and write down the date and time you found them. I'll add this to our case file. If they keep escalating, we might need to bring in a surveyor of our own to challenge whatever claim they're trying to make." James followed Lisa's advice, spending the next hour carefully photographing each stake and its position. He measured the distances from his house to the stakes, noting any inconsistencies in their placement. It felt surreal, like he was preparing for some kind of battle over land he had always considered unquestionably his. The whole situation seemed absurd, yet it was very real, and he knew that ignoring it would only make things worse. That evening, James sat on his porch, watching the sun set behind the trees. The warm hues of orange and pink painted the sky, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to relax. But the peace didn't last long. As darkness fell, he noticed something unusual, a faint flicker of light coming from the woods beyond his property. It was distant, barely visible through the dense trees, but it was definitely there. Someone was out there. He grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made his way toward the source of the light. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved through the underbrush, the crunch of leaves underfoot sounding unnaturally loud in the still night. When he got closer, the flickering stopped, and all he could see was darkness. He stood there for a moment, scanning the woods with his flashlight, but there was no sign of anyone. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard a soft rustling sound behind him. James spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the night, but again there was nothing. He waited, listening intently, but the sound didn't repeat. Feeling a growing sense of unease, he decided to head back to the house. He didn't know what was going on, but he wasn't about to take any chances. Once inside, he locked all the doors and windows and double-checked the motion-activated lights he had installed earlier. The next morning, James woke up to find something new waiting for him, another letter, this time taped to his front door. Unlike the first one, this letter wasn't printed on official-looking stationery. It was handwritten in messy block letters, and the message was simple: "Leave while you can." James stared at the note for a long moment, feeling a mix of anger and anxiety. Whoever was behind this was becoming more brazen. This wasn't just about legal pressure anymore, it was personal. They wanted to scare him, to make him feel unsafe in his own home. But if that was their goal, they had underestimated him. He wasn't the type to back down easily. He called Lisa again, updating her on the latest development. They left a threatening note this time, he said. "No signature, no way to trace it. Just a simple message telling me to leave." Lisa's tone was calm but firm. "This is harassment, plain and simple. It's good that you're keeping a record of everything. I'll report this to the local authorities, though I doubt they'll do much without concrete evidence of who's behind it. Still, it's important to have it on record." "Should I be worried?" James asked, though he already knew the answer. "Stay alert, but don't panic," Lisa replied. "They're trying to rattle you, to make you second-guess your decision to fight back. That means you're making them nervous. If they thought they could scare you off with a couple of letters, they wouldn't be resorting to this." James appreciated Lisa's confidence, But it didn't make the situation any less stressful. That night, he barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of what might happen next. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind outside, made him jump. He hated feeling this way, trapped, on edge, constantly looking over his shoulder. This wasn't the life he had imagined when he moved out here. He had come to the countryside for peace and freedom, but now it felt like he was under siege. The next day brought more unwelcome news. Lisa called to inform him that the development company behind the nearby luxury project had officially filed a notice of interest in his property. It's not a formal claim, she explained, but it's a signal that they're planning to make one. They're laying the groundwork to argue that your land should be incorporated into their development plan. James felt a surge of frustration. How can they do that? My land has been in my family for decades. There's no way they can just take it. They can't take it outright, but they can try to force a sale by making your life difficult enough that you give in. It's a common tactic in these situations: apply pressure, create uncertainty, and hope the owner caves. That's why we need to be ready for anything. James took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. He knew Lisa was right. This was a game of endurance, and he couldn't afford to lose his nerve. He thanked her for the update and ended the call, determined to keep fighting. As he stood outside, looking at the woods that surrounded his home, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. This land wasn't just a piece of property, it was his home, a place he had worked hard to build and protect. He wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. But even as he tried to steel himself for the battle ahead, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that things were about to get worse. The stakes were rising, and whoever was behind this wasn't going to back down easily. James didn't know what their next move would be, but one thing was certain: he needed to stay one step ahead if he wanted to come out of this unscathed. James could sense that things were beginning to spiral out of control. Every passing day brought new threats, new provocations, and an ever-deepening sense that he was up against something far more organized than he had initially believed. The tension was wearing him down, but it also fueled his determination. He hadn't come all this way to be driven out by intimidation. His grandfather's land wasn't just a piece of property, it was a legacy, a place his family had cherished for generations. He wouldn't let it be taken from him without a fight. Lisa was working tirelessly on his case, but the legal process moved slowly, much too slowly for James's comfort. In the meantime, he knew he needed to gather more information. He wasn't about to sit around and wait for the next move from the people trying to force him off his land. After all, whoever was orchestrating this campaign of harassment had already made it clear that they wouldn't play fair. That afternoon, James decided to take a walk along the far edges of his property. He wanted to see if there were any more signs of activity tracks, markers, anything that might give him a clue as to what his opponents were planning. As he made his way through the dense woods, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath his boots and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. After walking for about half an hour, he came to a section of the property that he rarely visited. It was remote, overgrown, and bordered by an old stone wall that had stood for as long as he could remember. His grandfather had once told him that the wall marked the original boundary of their land, though it had long since fallen into disrepair. James climbed over the wall and continued walking, his eyes scanning the ground for anything unusual. It didn't take long before he found something that made him stop in his tracks. About 20 yards beyond the wall, there was a small clearing, and in the center of that clearing stood a wooden stake similar to the ones he had found near his house. Attached to the stake was a laminated map showing the outline of a proposed development project. James's property was clearly marked on the map, with a bold red line drawn around it, as if it were already part of the planned expansion. James took a photo of the map with his phone, his mind racing. This was more than just a scare tactic, it was evidence of a deliberate plan to incorporate his land into a larger project. He had no doubt now that the development company was behind the pressure he was facing. They weren't just interested in buying him out, they were trying to wear him down until he had no choice but to sell. He sent the photo to Lisa as soon as he got back to the house. She called him almost immediately after receiving it. "This is exactly the kind of thing we needed," she said, her voice tense with both urgency and excitement. This proves they're actively planning to take your land even though they have no legal right to do so. I'll use this as leverage when we file our next motion." "Do you think this will be enough to stop them?" James asked, his voice laced with frustration. "It's a start," Lisa replied. "But don't expect them to back off just because we caught them red-handed. If anything, they might escalate their tactics now that they know you're not going down quietly." James nodded to himself, even though Lisa couldn't see him. He had expected as much. People like this didn't give up easily, especially when there was so much money at stake. Still, it felt good to have something concrete to fight back with. For the first time in days, he felt like he had the upper hand, if only for a moment. That night, as James tried to get some rest, he found his mind drifting back to the stories his grandfather used to tell him about the land. His grandfather had always been fiercely protective of the property, refusing to sell even when times were tough. James remembered one particular story about a group of investors who had tried to buy the land decades ago, promising to turn it into a luxury resort. His grandfather had turned them down without hesitation, telling James that some things were worth more than money. Now it seemed history was repeating itself. The faces had changed, but the greed remained the same. James felt a surge of pride in knowing that he was continuing his grandfather's fight, but he also knew that pride alone wouldn't be enough to win this battle. He needed allies, and he needed to be smarter than the people trying to force him out. The next morning, James decided to pay a visit to one of his neighbors, an elderly man named George who had lived in the area for over 50 years. George was something of a local historian, and if anyone knew about the history of land ownership in the area, it would be him. When James arrived at George's house, he was greeted with a warm smile. "James, it's good to see you. What brings you out here today?" James explained the situation, showing George the photo of the map he had found. George's expression grew serious as he listened. When James finished, George let out a low whistle. "I can't say I'm surprised," he said. "There have been whispers about that development project for years. They've been buying up land all around here, waiting for the right moment to make their move." "Do you know anything about this company?" James asked. "Only what I've heard from other folks," George replied. "They're well-funded, and they've got friends in high places. Most of the people who sold their land didn't do it willingly. They were pressured into it, one way or another. Sounds like they're trying to do the same thing to you." James felt a chill run down his spine. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by someone else made it all the more real. "Do you think there's anything I can do to stop them?" George thought for a moment before speaking. "Your best bet is to keep doing what you're doing, document everything, work with your lawyer, and don't let them intimidate you. If they see that you're not an easy target, they might move on to someone else." James thanked George for his advice and headed back home, feeling both reassured and more determined than ever. He knew the road ahead would be tough, but he also knew that he wasn't alone. There were people who believed in him, who wanted to see him succeed. And that gave him the strength he needed to keep going. That evening, as James reviewed the photos and notes he had taken over the past few days, he received another call from Lisa. "I've got some good news," she said. "I spoke with a contact in the county records office, and they're willing to help us get the documents we need. It might take a little time, but we'll get them." "That's great," James said, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "But there's something else you should know," Lisa continued. "I heard through the grapevine that the development company is planning to hold a public meeting about their project. They'll probably use it as an opportunity to rally support and paint you as the unreasonable one standing in the way of progress." James clenched his jaw. "Let them try. I'll be there to tell my side of the story." "Good," Lisa said. "Just be prepared, they'll likely have people there to back them up, and they won't play fair." "I wouldn't expect anything less," James replied. As he hung up the phone, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. The stakes were higher than ever, but he was ready. This wasn't just about saving his home anymore. It was about standing up to those who thought they could take whatever they wanted without consequence. And James was determined to show them that they were wrong. The morning after his conversation with Lisa, James awoke to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling in the distance. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes and hurried to the window, where he could just make out the faint outline of a construction vehicle through the trees, parked on the far side of the old stone wall at the edge of his property. His heart sank. He knew this wasn't a coincidence. They were ramping up their efforts, and this was likely the next stage of their campaign to pressure him into leaving. Throwing on his jacket and boots, James stepped outside, the cold morning air biting at his face. The forest was quiet, save for the low hum of the machinery somewhere beyond his land. He wasn't sure what they were doing, but whatever it wasn't good. Grabbing his phone, he took a few pictures of the area and noted the time. He remembered Lisa's words about documenting everything. This was exactly the kind of escalation she had warned him about. As he approached the old wall, James saw something that made his stomach churn. Just beyond the boundary line, several men in bright orange vests were clearing trees and marking the ground with spray paint. They were methodical, working quickly as if they'd done this 100 times before. James noticed that they were staying just outside his property, careful not to cross the wall. They didn't want to break the law outright, not yet, but they were clearly sending a message. One of the men, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a clipboard, noticed James watching and gave him a curt nod. "Morning," the man said, his tone overly friendly. "Just doing some preliminary work for the new development." "This is private property," James said, keeping his voice steady. "You have no right to be here." "We're not on your land," the man replied with a shrug. "We're surveying the adjacent plots for future development. Nothing illegal about that." James knew he couldn't argue with the man without escalating things further, but the whole situation felt wrong. Why were they surveying so close to his property? And why now, after weeks of harassment? He suspected they were trying to make him feel surrounded, isolated, as if they were closing in on all sides. It was psychological warfare, plain and simple. Without saying another word, James turned and walked back toward his house. He needed to call Lisa and let her know what was happening. As he made his way through the woods, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse. They weren't just trying to intimidate him anymore, they were making their move, and he had to be ready. When he got back inside, he immediately called Lisa, who picked up after only a few rings. "They started clearing the land next to my property," James said, keeping his voice low even though he was alone. "There are surveyors out there marking the ground," Lisa sighed on the other end of the line. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. They're trying to create the illusion that their project is inevitable, that resistance is futile. But they still don't have legal grounds to touch your land. Stay calm, keep documenting everything. And don't confront them directly. That's what they want. They want you to overreact so they can paint you as the unreasonable one." James nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "What's our next move?" "I'm filing an injunction to prevent them from encroaching on your property. It won't stop them from working on the adjacent land, but it'll send a message that you're not going down without a fight. In the meantime, keep your head down and don't engage with them unless absolutely necessary." James thanked her and ended the call, feeling a mix of frustration and determination. He hated the idea of standing by while they crept closer to his home, but he knew Lisa was right. Acting impulsively would only make things worse. Over the next few days, James tried to go about his routine as best he could, but the presence of the surveyors weighed heavily on him. Every morning he could hear the sound of trees being felled and machinery rumbling in the distance. He avoided going near the boundary line, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of knowing how much it bothered him. Instead, he focused on small tasks around the house, repairing a loose shutter, reinforcing the garden fence, anything to keep his mind occupied. One evening, just as the sun was setting, James noticed something unusual. A small drone was hovering above his property, its tiny propellers buzzing softly in the cool evening air. He watched it for a moment, unsure of what to do. Was it being used by the surveyors to map the area, or was it another intimidation tactic? Either way, it felt like an invasion of privacy. Grabbing his phone, James took a video of the drone, making sure to capture its movements and the direction it flew off in. He didn't have any proof of who was operating it, but it was another piece of evidence he could add to the growing pile. He sent the video to Lisa, along with a brief message explaining what had happened. The next morning, Lisa called him back with an update. "I filed the injunction, but it might take a few days for the court to process it. In the meantime, I've reached out to a contact who specializes in property disputes involving developers. They might be able to give us some additional leverage." James felt a glimmer of hope at her words. "Do you think it'll be enough to stop them?" "It's hard to say," Lisa admitted. "Developers like these are used to pushing people around. They count on the fact that most folks don't have the resources or the stamina to fight back. But you've already done more than most people would. You're standing your ground, and that's something they're not used to." James appreciated her confidence, but he knew the fight was far from over. Later that day, as he was working in the garden, he noticed a black SUV parked at the end of his driveway. It didn't move, and the windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside. James pretended not to notice, continuing to work as if nothing was out of the ordinary. After about 10 minutes, the SUV pulled away, disappearing down the road. That night, James found it difficult to sleep. He kept thinking about the SUV, the drone, the surveyors. Every little detail seemed to add up to something larger, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He felt like he was being watched, like they were waiting for him to make a mistake. The next day, he received a letter from the development company. It was a formal notice stating that they intended to proceed with their project and offering him a final chance to negotiate a mutually beneficial agreement. The tone of the letter was polite, almost friendly, but James could read between the lines. They were trying to pressure him into selling before things got uglier. He forwarded the letter to Lisa, who called him shortly afterward. "They're bluffing," she said. "They want you to think they have more power than they do. Don't let them scare you. We're making progress, and they know it. That's why they're trying to rush you into a deal." James took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I won't let them push me around," he said. "This is my home. I'm not going anywhere." As he hung up the phone, James felt a renewed sense of determination. The fight was far from over, but he was ready. He had come too far to give up now. Whatever they threw at him next, he would face it head on. This was his land, his legacy, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. The tension had reached a boiling point. James knew that the development company wasn't going to back off without a fight, and with each passing day, their pressure tactics became more aggressive. The letter offering a mutually beneficial agreement. It had been their thinly veiled attempt at coercion, but after he refused to respond, things escalated further. Every day, James noticed more activity near his property, vehicles coming and going, surveyors continuing to mark boundaries just outside his land, and the occasional drone hovering overhead. The air around him felt heavy, as though he were constantly being watched, and it was starting to wear on him. Despite the pressure, Lisa remained calm and focused. "The court has processed our injunction," she told James during their latest call. "They can't legally touch your property while this is in place. If they try anything, we'll have grounds to file a lawsuit. But I need you to stay vigilant. We're dealing with people who don't always play by the rules." James appreciated her confidence, but he knew that legality meant little to people who were willing to use intimidation as their main strategy. Sure enough, just 2 days after the injunction was granted, James came home from a quick supply run to find something that made his blood boil. One of the ancient oak trees on the edge of his property had been cut down. The tree had stood for over a century, a landmark his grandfather had often pointed out during walks through the woods. Now it lay in pieces on the ground, the stump freshly sawed and the surrounding area littered with branches and sawdust. James felt a surge of anger. This wasn't just about expanding a boundary or marking territory. Cutting down that tree was a message, a deliberate act meant to provoke him. He took photos of the scene and immediately called Lisa. "They've gone too far this time," he said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the frustration bubbling up inside him. "They came onto my property and cut down one of my trees." Lisa's tone hardened. "That's a clear violation of the injunction. We can use this against them, but we need to be smart about how we proceed. Don't confront them directly, let me handle it. I'll file a formal complaint with the court, and will demand compensation for the damage." James clenched his jaw, nodding to himself. He trusted Lisa, but it was hard to sit back and let things unfold at a slow, bureaucratic pace while the people trying to take his land became bolder by the day. Still, he knew she was right. If he acted impulsively, he'd only be giving them ammunition to paint him as the aggressor. Later that evening, as he sat in his small living room, James tried to clear his mind. He brewed a cup of tea and flipped through an old photo album his grandfather had left behind. The images brought back memories of simpler times, long walks through the woods, lazy summer afternoons spent fishing by the nearby creek, and his grandfather's stories about the land's history. This place was more than just a plot of land to him. It was part of his family's identity, a legacy he couldn't bear to lose. Just as he was beginning to feel a sense of calm, his phone buzzed. It was Lisa again. "James, I just got word from my contact at the county records office. You're not going to believe this, but the development company filed a motion late this afternoon to have the injunction lifted. They're claiming you're obstructing a vital community project. We have a court hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning." James's stomach tightened. They were moving fast, trying to bulldoze through any legal obstacles before he had a chance to fight back. "What do we do?" he asked. "Don't worry," Lisa said confidently. "I've already prepared our counter-arguments. They don't have the legal grounds to override the injunction, but they're hoping to intimidate us into backing down. We just need to stay calm and present our case clearly." The next morning, James arrived at the county courthouse feeling a mix of anxiety and resolve. Lisa met him at the entrance, her expression serious but reassuring. "Remember, they're counting on us to falter. Just stick to the facts, and we'll be fine." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. The development company's lawyer, a sharp-dressed man with a smug demeanor, wasted no time in presenting their argument. He spoke about progress and community benefits, painting a picture of a project that would supposedly bring prosperity to the area. James listened, his hands clenched into fists under the table, as the lawyer tried to frame him as an unreasonable obstacle standing in the way of modernization. When it was Lisa's turn to speak, she rose with calm confidence. She began by laying out the facts. James's property had been privately owned by his family for decades, and the development company had no legal claim to it. She presented the photos of the cut-down tree as evidence of their violation of the injunction, emphasizing that this was not a simple misunderstanding but a clear act of harassment. The judge listened carefully, occasionally asking questions to clarify certain points. James watched the development company's lawyer grow visibly uncomfortable as Lisa continued to dismantle their arguments piece by piece. By the time she finished, it was clear that the company's case was flimsy at best. After a brief recess, the judge returned with his decision. The court finds no legal basis to lift the injunction at this time. Furthermore, the evidence presented by Mr. Winslow's counsel regarding the unauthorized cutting of trees on his property warrants further investigation. Until that investigation is complete, the development company is prohibited from any further activity near Mr. Winslow's land. James felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had won this round, but he knew the fight wasn't over. As they left the courthouse, Lisa turned to him with a determined look. "They're going to regroup and try again. You should prepare for more tactics like the ones we've already seen. But don't worry, we'll be ready." James nodded, grateful for her support but fully aware that this was far from the end. The development company wasn't going to give up easily, and he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Still, for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight, and now he had the law on his side. That evening back at home, James allowed himself a moment to breathe. He stood on his porch, looking out at the forest that surrounded his tiny house. The land was quiet again, the tension of the past few days replaced by a calm stillness. But James knew better than to assume it would last. This was just one battle in a larger war, and he would need to stay vigilant. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the trees, James made a silent promise to himself. No matter what they tried next, he would be ready. This was his home, his land, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it from him. He had come too far, fought too hard, to back down now. If the development company wanted a war, they had found the wrong man to fight. In the days following the court hearing, the tension around James's property eased slightly. The injunction held firm, and for a brief period, the constant noise of heavy machinery and the sight of surveyors prowling the perimeter stopped. It was the first real break he'd had in weeks, and though James knew it was likely temporary, he allowed himself a moment to enjoy the calm. The fight wasn't over, but for now, it felt like he had won a critical battle. Lisa continued to keep him updated. They're regrouping, she said during one of their calls. It's common in cases like this. They'll lay low for a while, reassess their strategy, and figure out how to come at you from a different angle. But you've made it clear you're not an easy target. That alone makes a big difference. James appreciated Lisa's encouragement, but he remained cautious. He knew how these things worked. Companies with deep pockets rarely gave up after a single setback. If they couldn't force him out with intimidation or legal pressure, they might try something else. He had to be ready for whatever came next. One afternoon, as James was reinforcing the gate at the entrance to his property, he noticed a familiar black SUV parked further down the road. It was the same vehicle he had seen before, and just like last time, it stayed for several minutes without anyone stepping out. This time, however, James didn't just ignore it. He calmly took out his phone and snapped a few photos of the vehicle, making sure to get a clear shot of the license plate. Whether or not it would prove useful later, he didn't know, but he wasn't going to leave anything undocumented. The next morning, he received a surprise visit. George, his elderly neighbor, arrived unannounced, carrying a folder stuffed with old documents. "I've been thinking about what you said the other day," George began, settling down on the porch. "And I remembered something. Back when your grandfather first bought this land, he had a run-in with another group of developers. They tried to claim parts of his property, too. He fought them off, but before it was over, he made sure to get everything in writing: boundaries, ownership rights. All of it." James leaned forward, his interest piqued. George opened the folder and handed him a set of faded, yellowed papers. They were old surveys and legal documents, complete with signatures and official seals. One document, in particular, caught James's attention: a notarized agreement confirming that his grandfather's land was explicitly excluded from any future development zones. It was a critical piece of evidence, something that could shut down any further attempts to absorb his property. This is exactly what I needed," James said, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you, George. This could change everything." "Figured it might help," George replied with a grin. "Your grandfather was a tough old man. You remind me of him, you know. He didn't let anyone push him around either." Armed with the new documents, Lisa wasted no time filing a formal notice with the county, reinforcing James's claim to the land. The development company's attempts to contest his ownership became significantly weaker, and within a few days, word spread that they were reconsidering their plans for the project. They hadn't officially backed down, but their momentum had slowed considerably. A week later, James received an email from Lisa. "Looks like they're pulling out," it read. "I've been informed through unofficial channels that the company is shifting its focus to another location. It's not a public announcement yet, but it's only a matter of time. They know they can't win this one without a prolonged legal fight, and they don't want the bad press." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. He knew better than to celebrate too soon. There was always a chance they could return in the future, but for now it felt like he had reclaimed his home and his peace of mind. He had stood his ground, endured their harassment, and come out on the other side stronger for it. That evening, as the sun set over the forest, James sat on his porch with a cup of tea in hand, watching the light fade through the trees. The fight had been long and exhausting, but it had also reminded him of something important: why he had chosen this life in the first place. It wasn't just about the quiet or the beauty of the land. It was about the freedom to live on his own terms, without interference from those who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. In the weeks that followed, James focused on restoring the parts of his property that had been damaged during the ordeal. He repaired the garden fence, replanted some of the trees that had been cut down, and even added a few new features to his tiny house. Friends and neighbors stopped by from time to time, offering their support and admiration for how he had handled the situation. George, in particular, became a regular visitor. The two often sat together on the porch, talking about the history of the land and sharing stories about the past. It was during one of these conversations that George said something that stuck with James. "You know," he mused, staring out at the woods, "this land has always been worth fighting for. Not because it's valuable to anyone else, but because it means something to you. That's what makes it worth holding on to." James smiled, taking in the wisdom of those words. He knew the road ahead might still have its challenges, but he felt ready for whatever came next. This was his home, and he had proven that he was willing to fight for it. No matter what happened in the future, he would always stand his ground. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, James took one last sip of his tea and leaned back in his chair. The land was quiet again, and for the first time in weeks he felt a deep, unshakable sense of peace. The fight might not be over forever, but for now it was enough. He had won, and that victory was something no one could take away.